Today on the Tearsheet Podcast.
10 years after that, circa 2017, you have the four largest chat platforms in the world, eclipsing the active user base of the four largest social media platforms. And so for us, that became the era of what we call the chat economy. And so we as a company were the first to launch chat banking on the largest chat platform in the world for Absa Bank in 2018. And so, for us going forward, we are in early innings of a very exciting space called chat commerce.
Welcome to the Tearsheet Podcast. I'm Tearsheet Editor-in-Chief, Zack Miller. As chat platforms have eclipsed the size of the largest social networks, businesses are increasingly using them to service their customers. Some financial institutions are even enabled for customers to transact over chat. Pieter de Villiers, co-founder and CEO of Clickatell, joins me on the podcast to talk about his vision 20 years ago for mobile experiences. Now his firm covers more than 220 territories, 1,000 networks, and 85% of the world's population, with an SMS reach of more than 5 billion users. Pieter and I talk about banks embracing chat apps like WhatsApp to reach their customers. With chat banking, customers can get digital banking customer support, account management, and bill payment services right from within chat. Pieter de Villiers is my guest today on the Tearsheet Podcast.
Hi, Zack. I'm Pieter de Villiers, co-founder of Clickatell, and we essentially help large consumer brands to connect, interact, and transact with their customers where they are.
So unlike many guests sitting in your chair, Pieter, they're some of the oldest companies that we've interviewed, at least on in the fintech side, are 10 years old. You've been at this for 20 years. What was the sort of founding mandate, and why get into this space?
Yeah, it's quite a story. When we founded the company, we had a very simple objective, and that was, how do we connect the fastest growing commerce platform in the world, which was the internet at the time, with the fastest growing communications platform in the world, the mobile phone. It's actually quite ironic to think that back in 2000, those two worlds were not collided and they could not interoperate. So in November 2000, we launched 4 lines of code that enabled any website to send a mobile text message. And that really became the first SMS API in the world.
And were you thinking about servicing financial services firms at that time, or was it really focused on commerce?
It was not focused on financial services at the time. It was really about, how do you bring this commerce universe to communications? And we've always been interacting in this sort of convergence space between those. But financial services happen to be the early adopters and early movers. And so we launched the first transaction alert on SMS in the world for a bank called First National Bank back in the day. This was circa 2002. And we also did some of the first one-time pins in the world for WhatsApp and the like. So certainly, financial services and authentication became use cases that the early adopters went with, and we served them in that case.
And how have demands from the financial services industry evolved over time? Like, take us up to today.
Yeah, the way we look at it is, in the late 1997s, you had what we call the internet economy. So that brought about with it, e-commerce and internet banking. And again, the banking financial services sector were early adopters, and you almost have every bank, out there with a fairly large audience doing internet banking within a couple of years. 10 years later, you had another major shift in the marketplace where smartphones and iPhones were launched, and marketplaces like app stores were launched, and it ushered in what we call the app economy. And ergo, you also had then app banking and app commerce. And so 10 years after that, circa 2017, you have the 4 largest chat platforms in the world, eclipsing the active user base of the 4 largest social media platforms. And so for us, that became the era of what we call the chat economy. And so we as a company were the first to launch chat banking on the largest chat platform in the world for Absa Bank in 2018. And so, for us going forward, we are in early innings of a very exciting space called chat commerce.
You've mentioned a few different use cases. I guess it's worthwhile now kind of drilling down into each of those. I mean, there's obviously the authentication piece, but then there's also customer service and there's also transactional banking through chat. Like, can you talk about how Clickatell addresses those different areas?
Yeah, so in many markets, the driving force for technology adoption is different. Certainly in markets like South Africa or other emerging markets, there's a big delta between smartphone penetration and devices and data plan access and costs versus what banks' desires are in terms of serving their clients on a digital channel. So for them, it's a very logical economic decision, which is, I can grow my 18 to 22% mobile banking app penetration to 71%, which is the chat platform penetration, by simply leveraging my existing assets. So part of what we do for these banks is take the existing chat banking or mobile banking infrastructure and backend processes, but extend it over onto the chat channels. And so helping them reach more customers on these digital channels more conveniently.
And I guess my question as a corollary to that is when you are extending them onto these chat platforms, what are the activities that they're performing there? Is that primarily customer service? Does it go to the transactional layer?
Yeah, so it starts off typically as a customer service.
Mm-hmm.
We don't believe any brand wants to put their customer on hold, and most of the brands actually don't want to. But they are stuck in an analog voice call center world where scaling those environments is difficult. But it starts off, to your point, with customer service. What's my balance? Where can I find an ATM? Can you confirm the last transaction? And then eventually it moves over to bill payment type experiences. And so we do double digit in the millions of payment transactions for several banks per month on things like telecoms billing use cases.
Interesting. And I guess can you give us a little bit of a view into your clients' world? Like how mature are banks, the banking sector in general, about adopting, moving from customer service? Because it looks like that's pretty much table stakes now into like becoming more transactional oriented over chat.
Yeah, when we think it's table stakes, unfortunately, a lot of banks in the US, Canada, and elsewhere have experimented with chat bots. Now, unleashing a chat bot on a customer is not improving customer experiences. And there's been a bit of a pullback as a result. And I think one needs to be quite mindful of what is the customer journey you're creating and is it indeed better and living up to the expectations. So while customer service is the first port of call and should be table stakes, I think what you'll see in reality and on the ground is that a lot of banks have to redo their initial sort of customer chat self-serve banking projects. That said, from customer service, it moves into a transactional environment. Because many banks, if you think about it, have to stave off, these very aggressive challenger banks. And the big delta between a traditional bank and a challenger bank are really the unit economics and the efficiencies of how they run their operations. So not only do a bank gain significant value if they get customer service right, there's massive cost savings benefit. But then on the transactional side, just to close off the point, you can actually then get into other revenue streams and unit economics like bill payments, etc.
That's an interesting point you make, Pieter, because we definitely have heard that on this podcast and on Tearsheet in general. Like, there was sort of a fervor, building around AI bots and chat bots a couple of years ago. Some of the banks launched their own brands, and then we didn't hear about it for a couple of years. We've been commenting on that this year, and that's because it didn't really work for some of these banks. Like, is that because of the difference that you were making between an automated bot versus just a chat channel for customer service?
So our proposition, since we've been working in banks for many, many years, centers around the customer journey and experience, and less so around the technology stack. But the technology stack allows you to first and foremost connect with your customer on any channel of their choice. Second of all, orchestrate with drag and drop capabilities your different use cases or customer journeys that's most important to you and that creates the most friction compared to your call center journeys. And then ultimately actually complete the transaction, because most of the time when you and I engage with a brand, we don't only want to query a transaction, we also want to perhaps fulfill or complete a transaction. So, but it then breaks out to an agent desk at any point in time if you get stuck with the automation journeys. And that's a very important piece, that you can't, forsake your customer just on automation and hope that they navigate. You have to give them a fallback on an agent desk, and then you can use those same technologies to support the agent itself to get to the answer and the resolution faster. But just to your point, Zach, I don't want to ramble on, but it's super important that, the initial chatbots deployments were driven by AI hype, and really were quite disappointing in the expectation. You can achieve a lot with simple customer journeys. For example, simply knowing who you are when you reach out to the bank, not having to spell your name and, figure out your address details and things like that. They are very simple wins that one can achieve, and customers are loving these experiences when they're done right.
I like that idea, that they're the simple wins that help to propel the customer on that journey. So can you talk about, I guess, some use cases that your clients are using within banking, that are novel or worth mentioning, that are improving sort of the customer experience?
Yeah, so I think, there's the usual suspect use cases. If you go to most of your call center data sets and reports, you'll find that, it's the typical 80-20 scenario where consumers want to do the same thing over and over with their bank. And it's not difficult to help, get those FAQs automated. And to your point, that should be the first port of call. And we typically would start with menu-driven resolutions because it's not that foreign to a customer and they can navigate through it, and it feels a little bit more tactile. But then we can quickly go into keywords or full AI. In terms of the more unique cases, Absa Bank in South Africa was the first to launch on the WhatsApp channel. And in that experience, you can say, pay Zack $30, and it will come back with a single message and says, confirming paying Zack, account number ending XYZ, $30, yes or no, and that's it, you're done. Now, I'm not sure how long you've been outside of the US, Zack, but doing a wire transfer, even a Zelle payment, takes a whole lot more effort and steps than that. And I think a lot of the heavy lifting happens behind the scenes around authentication, validating the aliases and everything else to make sure that fraud doesn't hijack the transaction and diminishes the experience. But payments, ultimately, with a third party or friends and family, are things we naturally do on chat and are things that we enable for these banks and the larger brands.
That makes a lot of sense. And Pieter, based in South Africa, what is your geographic exposure for Clickatell? You are a global company, right?
Correct. My entire executive team sits in the US. Mm-hmm. However, I made a personal choice to be back in South Africa after being in the Bay Area for 10 years. Mm-hmm. At the rate people are, moving from the Bay Area, it may have been just an early adopter. But that said, there's still, a very strong contingent of our team in the Bay Area. And I think that, payments in emerging markets are super interesting. And certainly have eclipsed anything that's happened in the US in recent years in terms of innovation. And that's why having a strong presence here is important. But the US and the North American market is about a third of our business, mm-hmm. with the other 2/3 split between Europe and Mesa.
Got it. And I agree with you about, Asia and emerging markets eclipsing the US in terms of innovation, particularly in payments. But So that leads me to my next question. We've seen chat platforms in Asia really become sort of the crux of a user's everyday life through banking and ordering. It's all through the chat app. That's not necessarily the case in the US, even though chat usage is up. People haven't yet availed themselves in the same way. Do you see sort of cross pollination between that? Do you see the US moving in that direction that Asia has?
Yeah, we believe, first of all, Zack, I think it's important to know that chat commerce is in its first innings, right? It's early days. A lot of the technology sets that we provide and our competitors provide really were not available with the right level of confidence, even 18 months ago. But we are at a point now where the use cases for the US, I believe, will center around convenience. Again, whether it's Comcast or PG&E or AT&T, your customer experience with those brands are certainly less than optimal. And so we believe that there's a massive opportunity for chat and chat commerce to do better when it comes to a consumer's engagement with a large brand. But you're right that the driving forces for China, even India with Paytm, and perhaps even if you throw in Kenya's M-Pesa, were very different. But at the same time, consumers have got used to Uber-like, Airbnb-like experiences, even an Amazon-like experience, yet those brands that they typically engage with have quite a way to go. And we believe chat commerce is the answer.
So it's almost like you started Clickatell 20 years ago to be in the right space at this very moment, right? Like, I mean, you've been in the right space the whole time, but it's like everything's kind of coming together for you guys, it sounds like. Where are we headed next then?
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned, 20-year journey for a perfect storm to be able to act, because that's, kind of what one of our board members commented as well. And I think if you're patient enough and you can sustain and survive, sometimes the timing will eventually work for you. Where to next? We believe that the momentum that we're seeing for large consumer brands, in particular, financial services sector, is quite frankly the wave that we want to continue to ride. We feel we have an unfair advantage in that space right now. There's a lot of communication platform as a service players who can do the communication chat side, but we're really uniquely positioned as having more traction with both the communication and the commerce side than any one of our competitors right now. And there's a recent transaction yesterday where Facebook announced the purchase of Customer, which is a validation that this chat customer service space is going to be huge. And at the same time, many large brands, Google, Apple, etc., are making investments on the commerce side. So we think we'll be well placed to be a real player in the market and really help the brands do better for their clients.
I want to ask one question before we end, and that is what you've seen in your role, the impact COVID-19 has had on sort of your business and chat commerce in general.
Yeah, it's, I don't want to quote the same, things that people are quoting around the COVID bump in digital commerce. But what I can say to you, Zach, is that we serve one of the largest airlines in the world, for example, and they went down 96%. We serve probably the largest brand in hospitality, and they went down 64%. And so it's actually quite frightening if you think about the impact COVID's had in certain industries. Totally random. They could not predict it. No McKinsey consultant could tell you this is going to happen necessarily, or even if they did, you didn't plan for it. So we are cautiously optimistic and excited about where commerce is going, just generally on digital. But at the same time, we realize that those brands that we serve have to totally rethink their customer engagement models, their efficiencies, their economics. And I think having 10, 4, 5,000 person call centers is just not going to cut it when you have to recalibrate your operating model. And so we are right there to help them and see how we can be helpful.
Pieter, thanks for joining us on the Tearsheet Podcast today.
Thanks for the opportunity, Zach.